What's going on, fellas? Today we're going to talk about muscle and how you build it and the most effective things you should probably be doing in the gym if you don't want to look like a scrawny little bitch anymore. And you know what? Ever since I was a scrawny little girl, I've been pretty much obsessed with figuring out how I could not be that way, how I could pack on as much muscle in the most efficient, effective way possible so I could beat the skinny ass genetics that I was dealt. And it's been a long, painful road, lots of, some years of nice progress, some years of nada. Not much. And while I used to think I could just get away with buying smaller and smaller t-shirts to look bigger, that eventually too stops working. So this is what I know so far after 20 years doing this. Hypertrophy is a direct result of three main things: either mechanical tension, metabolic stress, or muscle damage. And another thing the research tells us is that as long as you're taking sets to near failure, it doesn't actually matter how heavy you lift or how many reps you do. You can do 8 reps or you can do 28 reps. You're going to get nearly the same muscle fiber recruitment and breakdown, and therefore growth, which is kind of shocking for a lot of people to hear. But there's a lot of nuances behind that. Also, the way you go about stimulating that muscle doesn't matter a whole lot either. You can do free weights, you can do body weight, you can do machines, you can do cables. And the science says and shows the amount of muscle you're going to grow is virtually identical as long as you're taking it to failure. So long as you're utilizing the laws of hypertrophy, that's really the key. And that's what we're going to get into. And I should note, from what I've seen from the literature, and a lot of the shit seems to change every decade, but I personally don't feel like going to failure every set, every exercise is necessary or even beneficial. But that said, I do think you should strive to hit complete failure on some of your sets throughout your entire workout every time you work out. And I know there's an argument for people out there wanting to say you don't need to do that, you should keep some reps in reserve because technically that's enough for growth, according to the research. But here's the thing that I can tell you for sure, because I've trained a lot of guys over the last 15 years. The vast majority of guys don't go to actual failure, and they're not doing what they think is failure. I guarantee you that. And that's why I say for most guys, it's probably still better for the majority to go to failure on a good chunk of their sets. So there's one thing that there's not a unanimous consensus on, and that's if we should train a muscle always at length. But from what I can see, it looks like, yes, it's definitely better most of the time to focus on that with your training. So then the question becomes, should we modify the range of motion on exercises to put more emphasis on that length and portion? Actually, yeah. And there's actually been some experiments that confirm that this is likely the case. So an easy to understand example would be a preacher curl. And there's actually been a study that had different guys basically just do various ranges of motion with the preacher curl. Some focusing on the full range of motion, other guys just doing the bottom half, the lengthened portion of it. And then other guys in this research test were only doing the top portion of the rep. And the results? Well, the group that had the greatest increase in overall muscle and cross-sectional muscle, the muscle closest to the elbow, came from the guys doing the preacher curls that focused on reps done in just the lengthened position. So even the group that did half reps, only doing the bottom portion, had the most muscle growth from that group. And it's significantly more than the guys who did the top portion of the rep only, which is pretty interesting to see and hear. So what does that actually mean in the real world? Well, in the real world, the thing that this really relates to is how we finish our reps and our sets and how you fail during an exercise. And I'll say it because I've seen it a million times from training guys for 15 years. Most guys suck at failing. Most guys end their sets the exact same way. They grind out the few last reps, putting all the effort into just moving the weight, forcing it to the top, letting gravity take over on that downward motion, the eccentric portion, slamming the weight down. Then they sit down on their phone, they grab a drink, they scroll their phone for 2 or 3 minutes, heart a bunch of thirsty girls on Instagram until their next set. The real mistake here is assuming that your muscle has been taken to real failure just because you were failing, just because you couldn't get a full range of motion and finish the reps with perfect form. And people assume that the top half of the range of motion is just as important as the bottom half and that you need perfect form to achieve failure. But if bigger muscles is your goal, this is not the case. And it means that regional hypertrophy, where the muscle grows, is dependent upon the range of motion. And more specifically, the initial range of motion is when the muscle is more at length. And there's a greater muscle breakdown and increase in mechanical tension. So all just to say, next time you're training, if you're flailing around just trying to get the reps in, when you get to that point where you're unable to make a perfect rep and get it to the top of the range, it's actually okay to cut down the range of motion, put more emphasis on squeezing out those half reps or those 3/4 reps in the lengthened position, like the preacher curl example. And this is how you should fail every set when you're taking it to complete failure. And the idea is you're getting more time under tension and more mechanical tension when you do that. When possible, train every muscle at length when you can. And I hope that makes some sense. This all sounds pretty simple when we're talking about a bicep curl. So it's a little easier said than done when we're trying to do something like a hack squat. But the key takeaway here is the point is not just to complete a rep, but rather to create as much muscle damage throughout that rep as possible. So doing a bunch of half reps at the end of a set that are actually hitting the muscle in that lengthened position, which might look kind of stupid to bystanders, is actually pretty helpful for growing, because that's where the real failure to that individual muscle lies.